The line at the co-op stretched clear back to the county road, a dusty parade of green and red and orange. It was late October 1976, and God had granted us a perfect harvest. The corn was dry, the yields were strong, and the price at the board inside was something a man could build a future on, or a debt, depending on his nature. I sat there in the cab of my old GMC grain truck, the one my father bought new in '62, listening to the tired groan of the clutch and the familiar rattle of the sideboards. Ahead of me, the air shimmered with heat and diesel fumes. Behind me, the same. Just another gear in the great machine of the harvest. My John Deere 55 combine was back in the shed, cooling its headers. It was a good machine, simple and honest. Not fast, not flashy, but it was mine. Every bolt, every belt, every bearing on it was paid for in sweat and cash, not promises to a man in a tie. I'd hauled 3 loads already that day, and this 4th one would likely be my last before sunset. The waiting was the hardest part. You could feel the season slipping away with every minute spent idling in line. That's when I saw it. A flash of brilliant red, so new it hurt the eyes. Richard Peterson's International Harvester, 1460 axial flow. It wasn't just the combine, it was the whole procession. The combine itself, riding on a brand new lowboy trailer, pulled by a Kenworth that still had the dealer tags in the window. Behind it, 2 of his brand new grain trucks, heaped to the gills, their chrome stacks glinting in the afternoon sun. He wasn't in line. Oh no, Richard Peterson didn't do lines. He swung his whole parade wide, right past the rest of us sodbusters, and pulled straight up to the unloading pit, blocking the guy who was next in line. The co-op manager, a nervous fella named Henderson, came scurrying out of the office, wiping his hands on a rag. Instead of telling Peterson to get to the back of the line, like any of us would have been told, Henderson was all smiles. He clapped Peterson on the back, pointed him toward the empty second pit they usually kept reserved. The grumbling started immediately, a low wave of discontent that rippled down the line of trucks. I heard old man Hemmings mutter something from the cab of his Ford F600 that would have made a sailor blush. Peterson just stood there, 1 foot up on the bumper of his truck, smirking. He was young, maybe 30, with a full head of slicked back hair and the kind of soft hands that told you he spent more time in a bank than in a field. His father had been a decent man, farmed a quarter section with an old Farmall H, but when the old man passed, Rich sold the H for scrap, went straight to the bank, and leveraged every square inch of that land to buy the 2 sections next to it and a full line of new equipment. He was the poster boy for what the farm magazines were calling the new era of agriculture. I finally got my turn at the pit. As my corn was auguring out, a slow golden stream, Peterson walked over. He didn't look at me, just at my truck. He ran a hand over a fender I'd patched with a piece of sheet metal 20 years ago. "Still running this old girl, Art," he said, his voice loud enough for Henderson and a few other guys to hear. "I'm surprised the floorboards haven't rusted out from under you." I just kept my eyes on the flow of corn. "She gets the job done, Rich." Getting the job done and making money are 2 different things. He scoffed. He gestured back toward his gleaming new IH. "That machine right there, it'll shell more corn in an hour than that museum piece of yours will do in a day. Time is money, Art. You're losing money just by standing still." I shut the gate on the truck bed and pulled the lever to lower it. The hydraulics whined in protest. "My museum piece doesn't have a $300 a month payment attached to it, Rich. My time is my own. I'm not losing a thing." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You're losing opportunity. While you're out there fixing 30-year-old junk, I'm buying land. In fact," he said, leaning in a little closer, a conspiratorial gleam in his eye, Henderson was just telling me the bank's about to foreclose on the old Miller place. 80 acres, right up against your north fence line. I'm putting in an offer tomorrow. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The Miller place. I'd been saving for that piece of ground since I was a boy. My father had always wanted it. It had the best soil in the county, black as sin and twice as rich. I had the money too, tucked away in a savings account, earning a piddling 2% interest. It was cash, real money, earned and saved. I was just waiting for the right moment. Peterson saw the look on my face. It was what he wanted. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was anything but friendly. Don't worry, Art. I'll be a good neighbor. Maybe I'll even let you rent it back from me for a fair price. You can work it with your antiques. He turned and walked away, laughing with Henderson. I stood there for a long moment, the dust and the noise of the co-op fading into a dull roar in my ears. I looked at his new combine, then at my old truck. He was right about one thing. Time was money, and I was running out of time. The world was changing, and it was threatening to leave me and everything my father had stood for behind in a cloud of dust. Now, before we go any further, before I tell you what I did that night and the years that followed, I have to ask you folks a question. Have you ever known a man like Richard Peterson? The kind of fellow who confuses debt with wealth, who thinks a shiny coat of paint is the same as a solid foundation. The world is full of them, then and now. Let me know down in the comments if you've ever had to deal with a neighbor like that, because it's a story as old as the soil itself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my account book and a stack of deposit slips. The numbers were all there. Black ink, neatly written. I had enough for a down payment on the Miller place, a big one. But Peterson wouldn't be making a down payment. He'd be getting a loan for the whole thing, rolling it into his already massive operating note. The bank, hungry for the high interest rates the government was encouraging, would give it to him without a second thought. Cash wasn't king anymore. Credit was. I walked out to the machine shed. The big doors were open to the cool night air, and the moon cast long shadows across the concrete floor. There she sat, the old John Deere 55. My dad bought her used in '68. She wasn't much to look at. The green paint was faded and chipped, showing patches of yellow primer underneath. A dozen different welds, laid down by my own hand over the years, held her together. But I knew her. I knew the sound the cylinder made when it was running just right, a low hum that vibrated up through the seat. I knew the exact amount of play in the steering wheel, the peculiar way you had to feather the variable speed lever to keep from plugging her up in heavy beans. I climbed up into the seat. The vinyl was cracked, and the stuffing was coming out, but it fit me like a glove. I looked out over the fields, over my fields, dark and resting under the harvest moon. And beyond them, the Miller place. I could almost feel the pull of that land, the promise of its rich black soil. Peterson thought he had it. The bank thought he had it. But they were thinking in terms of dollars and cents, of interest rates, and amortization schedules. I was thinking in terms of bushels and seasons, of sweat and steel. The next morning, I was up before the sun. I didn't drive to the bank. I drove to my fields. The dew was heavy on the corn stalks, and the air was crisp with the coming of autumn proper. I fired up the 55. The old four-cylinder engine coughed to life, belching a puff of blue smoke before settling into its familiar, lumpy idle. I engaged the header, lowered it into the standing corn, and pushed the throttle forward. The machine lurched ahead, and the work began again. I ran that combine like a man possessed. I ran her from dawn until long after dusk, stopping only for fuel and a quick sandwich my wife, Martha, would bring out to the field. The nights got colder. The days got shorter. Every time I'd crest the hill on the back 40, I could see the lights of Peterson's operation. His big IH-1460 moved through his fields like a battleship, its powerful halogen lights cutting through the darkness, gobbling up 12 rows at a time. My little 55, with its 4-row corn head, felt like a rowboat in its wake. Then, one evening, it happened. I was in the toughest part of the field, a low spot where the corn was thick and damp. I was pushing her a little too hard, trying to get one more load to the co-op before they closed. I heard a sound that every farmer dreads. Not a bang, not a crash, but a sickening, grinding crunch, followed by a high-pitched squeal. And then, silence. The whole machine shuddered to a halt. The engine was still running, but the header, the cylinder, the straw walkers, everything had gone dead. I shut her down and climbed out, my heart sinking into my boots. I grabbed a flashlight from the toolbox. The problem was obvious, and it was bad. The main separator drive belt, a massive thing, almost as thick as my arm, had snapped. But it hadn't just broken. In its final, violent moments, it had whipped around and shattered the main variable speed sheave, a heavy, cast-iron pulley that was the heart of the whole machine. Pieces of grey iron were scattered in the corn stubble like shrapnel. I spent an hour in the dark, trying to assess the full extent of the damage. The sheave was destroyed beyond any hope of welding or repair. It was a catastrophe. Harvest was half over, and my combine was dead in the water. Peterson would be done in a week. I'd be lucky to get done by Christmas, if at all. The next morning, I was at the John Deere dealership, before the mechanics had even started their coffee. I carried the broken pieces of the sheave in a burlap sack. The parts manager, a young kid named Kevin, who probably thought a Farmall M was a type of sports car, looked at the pieces with a blank expression. He tapped at his computer keyboard for a few minutes. "John Deere 55, you said." "That's right," I said. "Separator variable speed, sheave, the driven one." He shook his head, looking at the screen. "Says here that part is NLA." "NLA? What's that mean?" "No longer available," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "They stopped making parts for that machine 10 years ago. It's obsolete." Obsolete. The word hit me harder than Peterson's taunts. My machine, my livelihood, the piece of iron that my father had trusted and that I had mastered, was obsolete. "There's got to be one somewhere," I pleaded. "A dealership in another state? A salvage yard?" Kevin shrugged, already losing interest. "You could try, but your best bet," he said, gesturing to the showroom floor where a brand new John Deere 6600 gleamed under the fluorescent lights, "is to trade that old relic in and get yourself into a modern machine. We've got some great financing deals right now. Mr. Peterson just picked up a new 7700 last week." I looked at the price tag on the 6600. It was more than my entire farm was worth. I felt a cold anger rise in my chest. I scooped the broken pieces of my obsolete part back into the sack. "Thanks for your time," I said, my voice tight. I walked out of that dealership with a fire in my belly. Obsolete. We'd see about that. I wasn't going to the bank. I wasn't going to beg for a loan. I was going to my workshop. My shop was my sanctuary. It smelled of grease, old steel, and hot coffee. It was cluttered but organized. Every tool had its place. In the corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, were the two machines my father had prized most, a big, heavy-duty South Bend lathe and a Bridgeport milling machine he'd bought as war surplus back in the 50s. They were ancient, belt-driven behemoths, but they were precise and powerful. I laid the broken pieces of the sheave out on the workbench like a puzzle. The casting was too complex to weld back together. I would have to make a new one. From scratch. It was a daunting, almost impossible task. I wasn't a machinist, not a real one. I was just a farmer who knew how to fix things. But I had no other choice. For the next 3 days and nights, that shop was my entire world. I barely ate. I barely slept. I started with a solid round of steel, a heavy billet I'd been saving for just such an emergency. The first step was to turn it down to the right outer diameter on the lathe. The old South Bend whirred to life, the leather belts flapping, and I began to make the first cut. The sharp steel tool bit into the billet, and a long, curling sliver of metal, hot and blue, peeled away. The smell of cutting oil filled the air. Hour after hour, I worked, measuring with my calipers, taking off a few thousandths of an inch at a time until the outside was perfectly round and smooth. Then came the hard part. I had to machine the V-groove for the belt. This required grinding a tool bit to the precise angle and taking slow, careful passes. One mistake, one slip of the hand, and the whole piece would be ruined. My back ached. My eyes burned from staring at the spinning metal. At one point, Martha came out with a plate of food. I just shook my head, never taking my eyes off the work. While I toiled in my shop, the world outside kept turning. Neighbors would slow their trucks as they passed my farm, seeing the combine sitting silent in the middle of the field. The whispers started at the diner, at the co-op. Art Jensen's broke down for good. Heard he can't get parts. Should have upgraded years ago. Peterson's already done with his corn and is starting on his beans. Every rumor was a small twist of the knife. They saw a failure, a man stuck in the past. They didn't see the glowing blue chips of steel piling up on the floor of my shop. They didn't see the new part slowly, painstakingly, taking shape. After turning the outside, I had to bore the center hole for the shaft and cut a keyway with the milling machine. This was precision work, the kind that required a surgeon's touch. I checked my measurements 100 times. Finally, after 3 solid days of work, it was done. It wasn't as pretty as the original cast iron part. It was heavy, solid steel, with the fine lines of the machine tool still visible on its surface. But it was perfect. The dimensions were exact. The keyway was tight. I carried it out to the field like a newborn child. It took me the rest of the day to wrestle the new sheave and a new belt into place, working by the light of a trouble lamp hung from the side of the combine. My hands were raw, my knuckles were busted, but I finally tightened the last bolt. With a prayer, I climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine fired up. I took a deep breath and slowly, gently, engaged the separator clutch. There was a slight groan as the new belt tightened, and then a smooth, powerful hum. The whole machine came to life. The header chains rattled, the cylinder began to spin, the straw walkers began their rhythmic dance. It worked. By God, it worked. I sat there for a long moment, just listening to the sound. It was the sound of defiance. It was the sound of self-reliance. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I looked across the valley. Peterson's fields were dark. He was done. His shiny new combine was tucked away in his new machine shed. But my harvest wasn't over. I still had 100 acres to go. I lowered the header, pushed the throttle forward, and drove my obsolete machine back into the standing corn. The next couple of years were a blur of hard work. The grain boom of the 70s was in full swing. Prices for corn and soybeans were high, pushed up by massive sales to the Soviet Union. Land values were going through the roof. It was a time of incredible optimism in the heartland. For some, anyway. Richard Peterson was riding the crest of that wave like a champion. He bought the Miller place, just as he said he would, paying a price that made old-timers shake their heads in disbelief. But the bank didn't care. They gave him the money without blinking. The next year, he bought another 160 acres to the west. To work all this new ground, he traded his already new equipment for even newer, bigger stuff. A Steiger Panther 4WD tractor, a 24-row planter. His farm became a showcase of the latest technology. Every time a new piece of iron was delivered, it was an event. People would drive by just to look at it. He was the talk of the town, the new king of the county. The bankers loved him. The equipment dealers treated him like royalty. He was featured in an article in a big farm magazine, standing in front of his new grain bins with a confident smile, talking about expansion and leveraging assets. He was the future, and I was the past. I kept running my old equipment. The 55 combine, with its shop-made sheave, ran better than ever. My John Deere 4020, a tractor I'd bought with cash 10 years prior, was my workhorse. I didn't buy any more land. I couldn't compete with the prices Peterson and guys like him were paying. Instead, I focused on my own farm. I tiled the wet spots. I built up the soil with manure from my small herd of cattle. I paid my bills on time, and every year the balance in my savings account grew. But on the outside, it looked like I was falling hopelessly behind. My neighbors, many of whom were following Peterson's lead and going deep into debt to expand, looked at me with a mixture of pity and scorn. They'd see me out in the field, welding a crack on my old plough or replacing a bearing on my planter, and they'd shake their heads. Poor Art, they'd say, too stubborn to change. Even the banker, a man named George who had been friends with my father, started treating me differently. He'd call me into his office once a year to go over my finances. Art, he'd say, leaning back in his big leather chair, your balance sheet is, well, it's clean. Too clean. You have all this equity just sitting here. You should be using it. Land values are only going one way, up. You could easily afford to buy that quarter section south of you. We could have the papers drawn up by Friday. I don't like debt, George, I'd say, for the 10th time. Dad always said, don't bet the farm because one day the house will win. George would sigh, a look of frustration on his face. Your father was a good man, Art, but he farmed in a different time. This is the new era. You have to be aggressive. Look at Rich Peterson. He's going to own half the county in 5 years. I didn't argue. I just thanked him for his time and went back to my farm. I was a dinosaur, and I knew it. But I also knew that sometimes dinosaurs were the only ones who remembered what the world looked like before the fire came. One afternoon, late in the fall of '79, I was in the local diner for a cup of coffee. The place was buzzing with talk of high yields and even higher land prices. Peterson was holding court in a corner booth, surrounded by a group of other young, aggressive farmers. Their laughter was loud and confident. I sat at the counter, listening to the conversations around me. An older farmer next to me was talking to his friend. Heard on the radio this morning, he said, stirring his coffee. That fellow Volker up at the Federal Reserve is talking about jacking up the interest rates. Says he's got to kill inflation. His friend grunted. Politician talk. They're not going to do anything to mess with this gravy train. Not with the election coming up. They moved on to talking about football, but the words stuck with me. Interest rates. I thought about Peterson's massive loans, his operating notes, his mortgages. They were all on variable rates. That was the deal the banks were pushing. Low introductory rates that could be adjusted. As long as the economy was booming, nobody cared. But if those rates started to climb, I glanced over at Peterson's booth. He was drawing on a napkin, showing the others how he was going to lay out a new drainage system on the Miller place. He was planning for a future that he saw as a straight line, always going up. I looked out the window at the grey November sky. The clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy. A storm was coming. I didn't know when, and I didn't know how bad it would be, but I could feel it in my bones, and I knew that when it hit, it wouldn't matter how new your equipment was. The only thing that would matter was how solid your foundation was. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't in the sky, but on the radio. It was the winter of 1980, and I was in the shop rebuilding the carburetor on the 4020. The voice of President Carter came crackling through the small transistor radio on my workbench, announcing a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. He was punishing them for invading Afghanistan. To a politician in Washington, it was a move on a global chessboard. To us, it was a kick in the teeth. The biggest customer we had was suddenly gone. The price of corn at the co-op dropped 30 cents a bushel overnight. That spring, the mood in the county was sour. The easy optimism of the 70s had evaporated. Men who had been talking about buying new pickups were now wondering how they were going to make their payments. I saw Richard Peterson at the parts store. He was trying to buy a set of hydraulic filters for his big Steiger Panther. His face was pale, and there was a tightness around his eyes I hadn't seen before. The kid behind the counter ran his credit card. It was declined. Peterson's face went white, then red. He paid with a check, his hand shaking slightly as he signed it. It was the first crack in the gleaming armor. That summer, God decided to turn up the heat. A drought settled over the heartland like a suffocating blanket. The corn grew to be about waist-high, and then just stopped, the leaves curling up in the afternoon sun, turning a sickly, greyish green. The ponds dried up, and the creeks slowed to a trickle. Day after day, we watched the sky for a hint of a cloud, but it remained a merciless, brassy dome. My old 4020 chugged along, cultivating the beans, sipping diesel. I could work on it myself, keep it running for pennies. Peterson's big, thirsty machines were a different story. One afternoon, I saw his Steiger sitting in the middle of a field, a cloud of black smoke hanging over it. A service truck from the dealership was parked beside it. I heard later from a neighbor that the turbo had blown. It was a $3,000 repair, and the tractor was down for a week during the most critical time for spraying. $3,000. That was more than I'd spent on parts for my entire line of equipment in 5 years. The drought broke in late August with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what little corn was left standing. The harvest of 1980 was a disaster. Yields were half of normal, and the price was still in the gutter from the embargo. At the co-op, the talk wasn't of expansion anymore. It was about survival. The word on everyone's lips was interest rates. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, had declared war on inflation, and his weapon of choice was cranking the prime lending rate higher and higher. It went from single digits to 15%, then 18%, then over 20%. For me, it was an abstract number on the evening news. I had no operating loan. My only debt was the light bill. But for men like Richard Peterson, who were leveraged to the hilt on variable rate loans, that number was a dagger twisting in their gut. Every month, the letter from the bank arrived with a new, higher payment. A payment calculated on the fantasy yields and boom-time prices of the 70s, but a bill that had to be paid with the grim reality of the 80s. The cracks in Peterson's empire began to widen into chasms. He was the first in the county to have a farm sale. Not a foreclosure auction, not yet. He called it an inventory reduction sale. He sold his newer, smaller tractor and his big 24-row planter. He tried to act casual about it, telling people he was streamlining his operation. But we all knew what it was. It was a man selling off pieces of his ship in a desperate attempt to stay afloat in a rising sea of debt. I watched from the back of the crowd as his gleaming, almost new equipment was sold for 60 cents on the dollar to bargain hunters from out of state. He stood by the sale barn, his hands shoved in his pockets, his confident smirk replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He was no longer the king of the county. He was just another farmer, scared and running out of time. The winter of '81 was long and brutal, but the real storm hit in '82. It wasn't a blizzard of snow, but of paper. Foreclosure notices began appearing on the bulletin board at the courthouse, tacked up next to 4-H announcements and church bake sale flyers. They started as a trickle, then became a flood. Good men, honest men who had worked the same ground their fathers and grandfathers had, were being wiped out. The bankers, who had been so eager to lend money just a few years before, were now cold and unforgiving. George, my banker, seemed to have aged 10 years. The friendly smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, weary frown. The bank was in trouble too, carrying millions in bad agricultural loans. The farm crisis was no longer just a headline in the paper. It was the empty house down the road, the neighbors' kids who suddenly weren't in school anymore, the hushed, desperate conversations at the diner. It was a slow, grinding tragedy that was tearing the heart out of our community. Richard Peterson held on longer than most. He was a fighter, I'll give him that. He sold another quarter section of land. He let his hired man go and tried to do all the work himself, running day and night. His new equipment started to look old. The brilliant red paint on his combine was caked with mud and grease. Dents and scrapes appeared on the fenders of his trucks. He was working himself to the bone, but it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a bucket. The interest on his loans was compounding faster than he could possibly earn. The end came on a cold, grey morning in the spring of 1984. I saw the notice tacked to the door of the co-op, a public auction, the Peterson farm, all tracts, all equipment, all assets to be liquidated by order of the bank. The date was set for a Saturday in April. I almost didn't go. It felt like watching a public execution, but Martha said I should. "He was your neighbor, Art," she said. "It's the right thing to do, to at least be there." The day of the auction was miserable. A cold rain fell from a sky the color of lead. The crowd was a somber collection of neighbors, vultures from other counties looking for a deal, and grim-faced bankers in cheap suits. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with no sense of the occasion, stood on the back of a flatbed truck, his voice a harsh, rhythmic drone that cut through the damp air. Peterson's life was laid bare for all to see. His tools, his trucks, his tractors. The proud Steiger Panther, its turbo now silent, sold for a fraction of what he'd paid. The big IH combine, the machine he had once boasted would make him rich, went for less than the price of a new car. I watched as strangers rooted through his workshop, picking over the remnants of his ambition. Richard stood off to the side with his wife and 2 small children. He was a ghost of the man I had known. His slicked back hair was thinning, and his shoulders were slumped in defeat. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of stone, but I could see the tremor in his hands. Finally, the auctioneer moved on to the land. They sold it off in parcels. The quarter section to the west went first, then the home 80, with the house and the big new machine shed. And then the last parcel came up. "Lot number 7, the auctioneer barked. 80 acres more or less. The old Miller place. Prime ground, folks, the best dirt in the county. What'll you give?" A silence fell over the crowd. This was the piece of land that had started it all. The land I had wanted. The land he had taken. My neighbors looked at me. They all knew the story. They expected me to bid, to claim my prize, to finally put the boot on the neck of my fallen rival. The bidding started low. A land speculator from the city opened at $500 an acre. Another man countered at $600. I stood silent, my hands in my pockets, the rain dripping from the brim of my cap. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me. I had the money. I could have bought it right there, paid cash, and ended it. But as I looked at that land, and then at Richard Peterson and his family huddled under a small umbrella, I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a profound sadness. I walked away from the auctioneer's truck, slogging through the mud toward where Richard was standing. He saw me coming and stiffened, his jaw tightening. He probably thought I was coming to gloat. I stopped in front of him. I didn't look at the land. I looked him in the eye. "Rich," I said, my voice quiet. "I'm sorry." He blinked, taken aback. He seemed to shrink a little, the last of his pride crumbling. "You were right, Art," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "All this time, you were right. I was a fool." "No," I said. "You just listened to the wrong people." We all did. The bidding for the Miller place had stalled at $800 an acre. The auctioneer was trying to coax another bid. "Going once, going twice." I turned to Richard. "Do you still want to farm that ground?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes filled with confusion and despair. "What does it matter? It's over." "Answer the question, Rich." A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He nodded slowly. "More than anything." I turned and walked back toward the auctioneer, raising my hand. "900, I said, my voice clear and steady. A hush fell over the crowd. The speculator from the city shook his head and dropped out. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got 900 from Art Jensen. Do I hear 1,000? Silence. "Going once, going twice. Sold. For $900 an acre to Art Jensen." The crowd broke into a low murmur. I walked to the clerk's table, my old checkbook already in my hand. George, the banker, was there. He looked at me with a strange expression, a mixture of surprise and respect. I wrote the check for the full amount, my hand steady. As I signed my name, I felt no thrill of victory, only a sense of heavy responsibility. I had just bought back a piece of my own history, but I had also just become the owner of another man's dream. I walked back to Richard. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the ground, as if he couldn't bear to look at the field that was now mine. I held out my hand, not in congratulations, but to shake his. He looked at my calloused, grease-stained hand, then at his own, which were now just as calloused as mine. He took it. "I need a good tenant for that ground, Rich," I said. "Someone who knows it. The rent will be fair, 1/3 of the crop, just like in the old days. You can use my equipment until you get back on your feet." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. His wife began to cry, quiet sobs of relief. He just held on to my hand, his grip like iron, and nodded. In that moment, we weren't rivals anymore. We were just two farmers, standing in the rain, bound together by a piece of black dirt and the shared, brutal lessons of the land. The years that followed were a time of slow healing. The farm crisis bottomed out, and the long, slow climb back began. Many farms were lost forever, their homesteads bulldozed, their fields swallowed up by corporations. But for those of us who had held on, there was a renewed sense of purpose. The flashy, debt-fueled, new era of agriculture was dead. In its place was a return to the old ways, caution, thrift, and a deep respect for the unforgiving cycles of nature and economics. Richard Peterson became the best tenant a man could ask for. He farmed the Miller place with a quiet, fierce dedication. He used my old 40-20 and my 55 combine, and he treated them like they were his own. We worked side by side, fixing equipment in my shop, sharing coffee at my kitchen table. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hard-won humility. We never spoke of the auction again. We didn't have to. My own farm prospered. With the money I had saved, I was able to buy 2 neighboring farms from the bank at rock-bottom prices, not out of opportunism, but out of a desire to keep the land in the hands of farmers, not investors. I expanded my operation, but I did it my way, slowly, carefully, and with cash. My son, David, grew up in the shadow of the crisis. He didn't learn about farming from magazines that promised easy riches. He learned it from me, in the shop, with a wrench in his hand. He learned the value of $1 because he saw what happened to those who didn't. He saw me fabricate a part to save $100. He saw me walk away from a deal on a new tractor because the numbers didn't feel right. He went to college and got a degree in agricultural business, but he never forgot the lessons he learned on the farm. He understood balance sheets and amortization, but he also understood the soul of an old John Deere engine. By the late 90s, the world had changed again. Technology had exploded. GPS, yield monitors, genetically modified crops. It was a new revolution, but this time we were ready for it. David came home from college and took over the day-to-day management of the farm. He combined my old-fashioned caution with his modern knowledge. He adopted the new technology, but only when it made sound financial sense. Our farm grew, becoming one of the most successful and respected operations in the state. We were no longer just surviving. We were thriving. Richard Peterson, having saved his money and rebuilt his life, eventually bought the Miller place back from me, paying the same price I had, with no interest. He was a landowner again, his dignity restored. Which brings me to a sunny afternoon in the summer of 1999. I was older now, my hair more grey than brown, my hands permanently stained with the story of my life's work. I mostly just advised David, offering my opinion when he asked for it. That day, he asked me to ride with him to the John Deere dealership. We walked into the showroom, a vast, sterile space that smelled of new paint and fresh tires. The machines were monsters, towering green beasts with price tags that looked like telephone numbers. Behind the main desk, in a glass-walled office, sat the general manager. It was Kevin, the same kid who, 20 years earlier, had told me my combine was obsolete. He was heavier now, with a bald spot and an expensive suit, but I recognized him instantly. He saw us and came out, a practiced, professional smile on his face. He didn't recognize me at first. He just saw an old farmer in dusty overalls and a young, sharp-looking man. "Gentlemen," he said, extending a hand to David, "what can I do for you today? Looking to upgrade that planter?" David smiled, a calm, confident smile that reminded me of my father. "Something a little bigger than that, Kevin," he said. Kevin's smile faltered for a second as David used his first name. He was trying to place us. "We're looking to replace our combine fleet," David said, his voice even. "I want to buy 5 of the new 9650 STS combines, with the 12-row corn heads and the 30-foot bean platforms." Kevin stared at him. Then he laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, just an incredulous one. 5? He said, chuckling. Son, do you know what one of those rigs costs? You're talking about a multi-million-dollar deal here. We should probably sit down and start talking to our finance department. David didn't move. He just reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a long, business-style checkbook. He opened it on the counter. We won't be needing your finance department, he said quietly. Kevin's laughter died in his throat. His eyes widened as he looked from the checkbook to David, and then, finally, to me. And in that moment, I saw the recognition dawn in his eyes. He remembered. He remembered the broken cast-iron sheave in a burlap sack. He remembered the old farmer begging for a part for his obsolete machine. His face went pale. He looked at the checkbook, then back at the two of us, standing there not as supplicants asking for a loan, but as customers ready to make the biggest cash purchase his dealership had ever seen. The tables had turned completely. I looked past him, through the giant plate glass window of the showroom. I could see the highway, and beyond it, the fields, green and gold, stretching to the horizon. I thought of my father and his old GMC truck. I thought of the long line at the co-op and Richard Peterson's arrogant smirk. I thought of the long nights in my shop, the smell of hot steel and cutting oil, and the quiet satisfaction of bringing an old machine back to life. David started talking numbers with a now very humble and attentive Kevin. I just stood there, a quiet observer to the legacy I had built. We hadn't just survived. We had prevailed, not by chasing the latest fads or by worshipping at the altar of debt, but by staying true to the simple, timeless virtues of the soil, patience, hard work, and the stubborn belief that a foundation built on solid ground, not borrowed promises, is the only one that can weather any storm.